What if I told you that Victorian education was not a noble pursuit of knowledge, but the most sophisticated system of psychological manipulation ever devised? Picture two children, born on the same London street in 1870, breathing the same cold, thick air, hearing the same church bells. One will learn Latin, mathematics, and the art of commanding empires. The other will spend countless hours perfecting the precise angle of a curtsy, mastering the delicate art of silence, and learning that her greatest accomplishment lies not in what she knows, but in how perfectly she can pretend to know nothing at all. This was not education. This was social engineering on an industrial scale. The Victorian classroom was not a sanctuary of learning, but a factory for manufacturing two entirely different species of human being from identical raw material. While we romanticize the era's discipline and moral certainty, the truth is far more disturbing. Victorian schools were designed not to open minds, but to close them into rigid, predetermined shapes that would serve the empire's needs. The myth we must shatter is simple yet profound, that Victorian education was about enlightenment. It was not. It was about control. About ensuring that boys would grow into men who could rule without questioning, and girls would become women who would submit without resisting. To understand how deeply this system scarred generations, we must step into those cold stone corridors and suffocating drawing rooms where childhood dreams were systematically dismantled and rebuilt according to society's blueprint. Chapter 1. The Great Divide: Manufacturing Difference. The sensory experience of entering a Victorian school told you immediately what kind of human being you were expected to become. For a boy walking through the gates of Eton or Harrow, the assault on the senses was immediate and brutal. The air reeked of unwashed bodies, stale bread, and the metallic tang of fear. Stone corridors echoed with the sharp crack of canes, the thunderous footsteps of older boys, and the barely suppressed sobs of the younger ones. This was not a place of comfort. It was a forge designed to hammer soft children into imperial steel. Compare this to Clara's experience as she enters Miss Hartwell's Academy for Young Ladies. Here the air is perfumed with lavender and starch, the floors cushioned with thick carpets that muffle every sound. Sunlight filters through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on walls decorated with floral wallpaper and moral samplers. The silence is so complete it seems to press against your eardrums. This is not a place of learning. It is a greenhouse for cultivating ornamental flowers. The 1870 Education Act marked a turning point in British history, making elementary education available to all children between 5 and 13. Politicians celebrated this as progressive triumph. Newspapers proclaimed a new age of enlightenment. But buried within the legislation was a clause that would shape millions of lives. Schools were permitted, indeed encouraged, to provide different curricula based on the student's sex. This was not oversight but intentional design, defended by the most educated minds of the era as natural and necessary. Edward, 12 years old and son of a respectable clerk, arrives at his grammar school with chapped fingers and worn boots, but his eyes burn with ambition. The masters have told him repeatedly that his future depends entirely on what happens within these walls. His classroom smells of chalk dust, ink, and determination. Maps of the British Empire cover the walls, those vast pink territories spreading across 3 continents that represent not just geography but destiny. The desks are arranged in military rows, and the noise level would shock anyone accustomed to feminine educational spaces. Boys argue, debate, laugh loudly. Their voice is confident and unapologetic. Meanwhile, Clara sits in her academy's drawing room, practicing the art of pouring tea without spilling a drop. Her posture is rigidly correct, her voice modulated to never rise above a whisper. She has been taught that unnecessary noise is unladylike, that her footsteps should apologize for disturbing the air. Every movement must be monitored, adjusted, perfected, until artificial grace becomes second nature. She is learning to experience her body as a constant performance subject to critical evaluation. The psychological architecture being constructed here is breathtaking in its sophistication. Edward is being taught that the world expects things of him, that he must be ready to lead, to argue, to command. His education assumes he will shape history. Clara is being taught that her role is to observe the world, not change it. She may sketch landscapes but will never own the land. She may play Beethoven but will never compose symphonies. Her education assumes she will decorate history, not write it. But who enforced this system? Who carried the daily burden of crushing young spirits into acceptable shapes? To understand the true machinery of Victorian education, we must look beyond the students to those caught between worlds, the teachers, tutors, and governesses who wielded the tools of intellectual suppression while often being victims of the same system themselves. Chapter 2. The Curriculum of Confinement, What Girls Were Never Meant to Know. Miss Elizabeth Gray rises before dawn in her small, cold room above the schoolroom. She is 35, unmarried, educated enough to teach but not enough to escape. Her own schooling consisted of the same accomplishments she now imparts to her pupils, supplemented by secret reading of her brother's university texts before her father discovered her transgression and burned every forbidden book. Now she stands before Clara and her sisters, a living warning of what happens to women who fail to secure a husband. The morning begins with deportment, an hour of practicing how to walk with books balanced on their heads, learning to glide rather than stride, to occupy space without claiming it. This is not vanity being taught, but control. Every gesture must be artificial, calculated, performed. The girls practice sitting and standing in ways that display their skirts advantageously, while revealing nothing of their actual bodies. Modern research into embodied cognition shows that how we move affects how we think. When you teach a girl that her natural movements are wrong, you teach her that her authentic self is unacceptable. After deportment comes needlework, a subject that consumed more hours than mathematics, science, and history combined. This went far beyond practical necessity. It was elevated to moral discipline and character test. Clara strains her young eyes in poor light, creating thousands of perfect, identical stitches on elaborate samplers, featuring biblical verses about patience and submission. Her fingers bleed, her back aches from hunching over her work. But she continues because needlework teaches the most important lesson of all: how to find meaning in meaningless work. How to sacrifice time and health for objects whose only function is displaying one's own subjugation. The contrast with Edward's simultaneous education is stark and deliberate. While Clara stitches samplers, Edward conducts chemistry experiments, dissects frogs to understand anatomy, engages in vigorous debates about political philosophy. While Clara learns to make her stitches smaller and more uniform, Edward learns to make his arguments stronger and more persuasive. The message could not be clearer. Boys are being prepared to shape the world. Girls are being prepared to decorate it. Music and drawing, though potentially creative, were taught as performance skills rather than artistic expression. Clara's piano lessons focus on mechanical precision, reproducing exactly what appears on the page to provide drawing room entertainment after dinner. Her art instruction involves copying botanical illustrations with painstaking accuracy, pleasant decorations that demonstrate refinement without challenging assumptions about what women could create. She is never encouraged to develop artistic vision, experiment with techniques, or use art to explore inner life or comment on the world. The most revealing subject was domestic science, housewifery. Girls as young as 8 learned intricate household management details, proper linen folding, room cleaning sequences, larder organization. They practiced making beds with hospital corners, polishing silver until it gleamed, arranging flowers pleasingly but not ostentatiously. Cooking lessons were particularly telling. Girls learned to follow recipes with absolute precision, but were never taught underlying principles. They could produce meals without understanding the chemistry of heat transformation, the physics of emulsification, or the biology of fermentation. This ensured cooking remained mechanical skill rather than science, keeping female minds confined to the practical and immediate. What makes this educational apartheid even more disturbing is that many women teaching these subjects were themselves intelligent individuals who might have excelled in any field given opportunity. Miss Gray had once dreamed of studying medicine. The needlework instructor had taught herself Latin by secretly reading her brother's textbooks before her father discovered her transgression. The music teacher had composed original pieces before being told composition was inappropriate for ladies. These women had been broken by the system and now served as its enforcers, passing limitations to the next generation. Yet even within this oppressive structure, small rebellions occurred. Some teachers smuggled real knowledge into lessons, hiding mathematical concepts within household accounting, or introducing historical facts during domestic management discussions. Some girls refused to accept limitations, reading brothers' textbooks secretly, asking uncomfortable questions, maintaining internal conviction that they were capable of more than society allowed. These small acts of resistance rarely changed the system, but kept alive the possibility that change might someday come. But what of the boys during these same hours? What were they learning while their sisters practiced needlework and deportment? The answer reveals the true scale of educational inequality that defined the Victorian era. Chapter 3. Forging Imperial Minds, the Masculine Curriculum of Command. The boys' classroom bears no resemblance to its female counterpart down the hall. The desks are larger, sturdier, arranged in rows suggesting military order rather than decorative display. Maps showing the British Empire's extent cover the walls, vast pink territories representing not just geography, but worldview. The assumption that British men had both right and duty to govern 3/4 of the globe. The noise level would shock anyone accustomed to enforced feminine silence. Boys talk, argue, laugh, their voices loud and confident, movements expansive and unapologetic. Mr. Thomas Bradford enters and chaos resolves into order through respect, rather than fear. This Oxford classical scholar believes education's purpose is producing men capable of leadership, independent thought, and moral courage. He begins with Cicero's De Officiis, reading first in Latin, then providing translation. Boys follow in their own copies, annotating rhetorical strategies and philosophical arguments. This is not rote memorization, but active engagement with ideas that shaped Western civilization for 2 millennia. Classical languages form the cornerstone of boys' education, their importance extending far beyond reading ancient texts. Latin and Greek were considered ultimate mind training, developing logical thinking, precise expression, and complex argument analysis. A boy parsing Latin sentences, identifying word functions, and understanding structural relationships developed cognitive skills serving any intellectual pursuit. He learned systematic thinking, pattern recognition, understanding how elements combine to create larger structures, transferable skills applicable to law, medicine, science, politics, or business. But classics served another purpose: social gatekeeping. A man quoting Horace in Latin or discussing Plato in Greek was immediately recognizable as properly educated, belonging to the governing class. The languages mattered less than what they signified. Membership in an exclusive club sharing common cultural references, recognizable across national boundaries. This was education as social sorting, ensuring power remained concentrated among traditional holders. Mathematics education for boys was equally ambitious. Edward studies algebra, manipulating abstract symbols representing unknown quantities, developing ability to think in variables and relationships rather than fixed numbers. He works through geometric proofs, constructing logical arguments moving from axioms to conclusions with rigorous precision. Trigonometry introduces elegant relationships between angles and sides essential for navigation, engineering, and astronomy. This is mathematics as reality understanding tool for solving non-existent problems, building the bridges, railways, and telegraph systems transforming the Victorian world. Science education was forward-looking and comprehensive. Laboratory experiments in chemistry taught observation of reactions, element and compound properties, invisible forces governing material world. Physics covered electricity, magnetism, forces, motion, energy conservation, thermodynamics laws. Animal dissection revealed life's intricate machinery examined with the same analytical rigor applied to mathematics and classics. This was science as inquiry method, question asking and hypothesis testing, applicable to any problem. History lessons were exercises in nation building and imperial justification. Boys learned about great men shaping British history: kings, generals, explorers, inventors, politicians, philosophers. Military campaigns were studied in detail, learning strategy and tactics, understanding how decisions determine battle outcomes and change nations' courses. Empire rise and fall was examined with implicit messaging that the British Empire represented human progress culmination, natural result of British superiority in character, intelligence, and moral virtue. Perhaps most importantly, boys learned to speak and write with authority, presenting ideas confidently, arguing positions forcefully. Rhetoric and debate were central, serving whether they entered politics, law, church, or business. They learned argument construction, objection anticipation, evidence marshaling. Public speaking practice involved delivering orations before classmates on topics ranging from trivial to profound. They were encouraged to be bold, take intellectual risks, defend uncertain positions because confidence appearance was as important as argument substance. Physical education through sports was equally crucial preparation. Cricket, rugby, and rowing were more than games. They were leadership training, teaching teamwork, graceful victory, and defeat acceptance, pushing bodies beyond perceived limits. A boy leading his team to victory demonstrated qualities needed for military service, colonial administration, or business competition. The famous phrase, "The Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton," captured this belief that boyhood sports character would determine nations' fate. The system of fagging at public schools revealed education's hidden curriculum most starkly. This institutionalized hierarchy made younger boys essentially older boys' slaves. A 12-year-old might wake at 5 to polish a 17-year-old prefect's boots, toast bread, warm beds, run errands. Failure meant beatings, not from teachers, but from older students. This taught simple lessons. Power is right, those above have absolute authority, those below are yours to command. It trained young Victorian males that empathy was weakness. To survive cold dormitories and beatings, they built shells, repressed emotions. The stiff upper lip was not genetic, but scar tissue over childhood suppressed tears. Yet even this privileged system had hierarchies and exclusions. Working-class boys in elementary schools received far more limited education than middle and upper-class counterparts. They learned basic literacy and numeracy sufficient for following instructions and keeping simple accounts, but not Latin or advanced mathematics. They were prepared for clerk, tradesman, or factory worker lives, not leadership or professional roles. The educational system reproduced class distinctions as surely as gender distinctions. Boys receiving full classical education emerged with profound entitlement and capability sense. They had been repeatedly told they were destined for greatness, that the world was theirs to shape and command, that their opinions mattered and voices deserved hearing. They received tools, languages, mathematics, rhetoric, scientific method, allowing engagement with complex ideas and difficult problem-solving. They learned to see themselves as history's protagonists, actors determining future human events. Whether they actually possessed superior intelligence was almost irrelevant. They received education and confidence to act as if they did. But this system's psychological cost was enormous. These boys became men who could rule empires but couldn't talk to their wives, who carried the world's weight with no emotional outlet. London clubs filled with men drinking to numb their soul's silence. They succeeded in becoming what school promised: leaders, commanders, stoics, but failed to become fully human. The question haunting anyone studying Victorian education is, what might have been discovered what problems solved, what art created, if half the population hadn't been deliberately denied intellectual development tools. Chapter 4. The Invisible Architect's Teachers in the Machine. Between the commanding presence of the schoolmaster and the submissive silence of his pupils exists a shadowy figure whose story reveals the Victorian educational system's deepest contradictions. Miss Caroline Webb, governess to the Hartwell family, represents thousands of women caught between worlds, too educated for their station, not educated enough for freedom. At 32, Miss Webb possesses a mind that would have flourished in any era but this one. She speaks 3 languages fluently, has read extensively in philosophy and literature, and once composed musical pieces of genuine originality before being told that composition was inappropriate for ladies. Now she sits in the nursery schoolroom, surrounded by the tools of intellectual suppression she must wield daily: moral readers filled with stories of obedient daughters, arithmetic books that never progress beyond household calculations, and embroidery patterns designed to occupy young minds with beautiful meaninglessness. The governess occupied a uniquely tragic position in Victorian society. She was neither servant nor family member, educated but powerless, genteel but impoverished. She ate alone in a small, cold room, her dresses neat but always slightly out of fashion. Her presence in middle-class homes served as both necessity and warning. Necessary because parents needed someone to shape their daughters' minds, but warning because she represented what happened to women who failed to secure husbands. She was the ghost of Christmas future, sitting in the corner of every schoolroom. Miss Webb's daily routine reveals the psychological torture of enforcing limitations she herself had transcended. When Clara asks why women cannot study medicine like men, Miss Webb must gently redirect the conversation to more appropriate topics. When the girl shows fascination with the mathematical principles underlying music, the governess must steer her back to mechanical practice of prescribed pieces. Every day, she watches bright young minds being systematically dimmed, knowing that she is the instrument of that dimming. The male teachers face their own constraints, though their prisons were gilded with social respect and professional advancement possibilities. Mr. Bradford, the classics master, genuinely believes in education's transformative power, but he operates within a system that defines transformation narrowly. He can teach boys to think critically about ancient texts, but not about contemporary social arrangements. He can encourage intellectual boldness, but not emotional vulnerability. He can prepare students for leadership, but not for genuine partnership with women as equals. The curriculum these teachers implemented was carefully designed to produce complementary but unequal adults. Boys learned subjects that prepared them for public life: Latin for legal and political discourse, mathematics for engineering and commerce, rhetoric for persuasion and command. Girls learned subjects that prepared them for private life: enough literacy to read moral literature and write letters, enough arithmetic to manage household accounts, enough accomplishments to provide entertainment and demonstrate refinement. But the hidden curriculum was even more important than the official one. Boys learned that their voices mattered, that their opinions were worth expressing, that the world was theirs to shape. They were encouraged to argue, to compete, to take up space, both physical and intellectual. Girls learned the opposite, that their highest virtue lay in self-effacement, that their role was to listen rather than speak, to support rather than lead, to sacrifice their own desires for others' comfort. The teachers enforcing these lessons often struggled with their own contradictions. Miss Webb had to praise Clara for a perfectly executed curtsy, while suppressing her own knowledge that the girl's mathematical insights were more impressive than her brother's Latin translations. Mr. Bradford had to celebrate Edward's rhetorical victories while knowing that the boy's emotional intelligence was being systematically stunted. They were complicit in a system that wasted human potential on an industrial scale. Some teachers found small ways to resist or subvert the system. A governess might smuggle real literature into reading lessons, introducing girls to authors who wrote about women's inner lives and struggles. A schoolmaster might encourage a sensitive boy's interest in poetry, even knowing it marked him as potentially unfit for imperial service. These acts of quiet rebellion rarely changed outcomes dramatically, but they planted seeds that might bloom years later when social conditions became more favorable. The economic realities facing teachers also shaped their relationship to the system. Governesses were entirely dependent on their employers' goodwill, making them reluctant to challenge educational orthodoxies that might cost them their positions. Male teachers had more security but also more investment in the system's continuation. Their careers depended on producing the kinds of graduates that society expected and rewarded. Yet these teachers were also witnesses to the system's failures. They saw boys broken by the brutality of public school life, rendered incapable of emotional intimacy or genuine empathy. They saw girls whose intellectual gifts withered from lack of nourishment, who developed the nervous ailments and mysterious illnesses that Victorian medicine attributed to feminine weakness, but that modern psychology recognizes as symptoms of chronic frustration and suppression. The most perceptive teachers understood that they were participating in a vast social experiment whose results would shape not just individual lives, but the entire culture. They were creating men who could build empires, but not happy marriages. Women who could manage households, but not their own destinies. They were producing a society of strangers, where husbands and wives lived parallel lives that rarely intersected at the level of genuine understanding or mutual respect. As we observe these teachers going about their daily work, correcting posture, grading compositions, enforcing silence, we must remember that they were both perpetrators and victims of the system they served. They carried out the systematic suppression of human potential, not from malice, but from their own conditioning, their own fears, their own limited understanding of what education could and should accomplish. Their stories remind us that social change requires not just policy reforms, but transformation of the hearts and minds of those who implement policy at the most intimate level of daily human interaction. Chapter 5. The Rebels and the Seeds of Change. But not everyone accepted the Victorian educational orthodoxy without question. Even at the height of the system's power, voices called for reform. Educators and activists who recognized that gender-based curriculum was not natural law but human choice that could be challenged and changed. These reformers faced enormous obstacles: social disapproval, funding shortages, active opposition from beneficiaries of existing arrangements. Yet they persisted, creating alternative institutions and writing treatises that laid groundwork for future educational equality. Emily Davies stands as one of the most important yet under-recognized figures in this movement. Born in 1830 to a respectable middle-class family, Davies received typical education for girls of her class: minimal reading and writing, extensive needlework, constant instruction in accomplishments designed to enhance marriageability. But Davies possessed an inquiring mind that could not be satisfied with embroidery samplers and deportment lessons. She began reading her brother's textbooks, teaching herself subjects supposedly beyond female comprehension. When she discovered she could understand Latin grammar and mathematical proofs as well as any boy, she began questioning why girls were denied such knowledge. The opposition Davies faced reveals the depth of resistance to educational equality. When she founded Girton College in 1869 as the first residential college for women in Britain, critics argued that advanced study would damage women's health, particularly their reproductive systems. Medical authorities solemnly warned that intellectual energy would be diverted from the womb, rendering educated women sterile or prone to miscarriage. Others insisted that even if women could learn the same material as men, they lacked original thought and creative genius required for true intellectual achievement. They might memorize and regurgitate, but could never innovate or discover. Davies understood that anything less than complete equality would be used as evidence against women's intellectual capacity. Girton students would study identical subjects to Cambridge men: Latin, Greek, mathematics, science, history, philosophy. They would take the same examinations, held to identical standards, expected to demonstrate equal mastery. This revolutionary simplicity proved critics wrong. Women not only survived rigorous study, but excelled, scoring as well as or better than male counterparts on examinations. Yet even success wasn't enough to immediately change the system. Cambridge University refused to grant degrees to women until 1948, more than 70 years after Girton's founding. Women could demonstrate mastery, but couldn't receive official recognition allowing professional use of their education. This was the last defense line for equality opponents. If you cannot prevent women from learning, at least prevent them from being credentialed. Other reformers took different approaches to challenging educational status quo. Frances Mary Buss founded the North London Collegiate School for Ladies in 1850, creating a day school offering girls more academic curriculum than typical for the time. Buss believed education should prepare women for economic independence, recognizing that not all women would marry, and even those who did might find themselves widowed or abandoned and needing self-support. Her school taught not just accomplishments, but practical skills, bookkeeping, typing, basic science, allowing graduates to work as governesses, clerks, or teachers. Dorothea Beale, headmistress of Cheltenham Ladies' College, argued that women needed education not to compete with men, but to better fulfill their roles as society's moral guardians. Beale believed in gender difference and didn't advocate for women entering male-dominated professions, but insisted women couldn't properly guide their families' moral and spiritual development without serious intellectual training. Her arguments were conservative in some ways, reinforcing traditional gender roles, but provided justification for female education more palatable to Victorian society than Davies's more radical complete equality vision. These different strategies reveal the complexity of fighting for educational equality. Should reformers demand immediate, complete equality, or accept incremental changes moving in the right direction even if insufficient? Should they argue that women and men were fundamentally the same and therefore deserved identical treatment? Or claim that women's difference from men made their education equally important, but perhaps differently focused? These debates weren't just tactical, they reflected genuine disagreements about gender nature, education purpose, and the kind of society reformers hoped to create. Resistance to educational reform came from unexpected quarters. Many women, products of the traditional system, genuinely believed gender-based curriculum was appropriate and beneficial. They had found meaning and satisfaction in wives' and mothers' roles, seeing reformers as attacking not just an educational system, but a way of life. These women argued that pushing for educational equality would make girls unhappy by giving them unfulfillable aspirations, creating a generation dissatisfied with domestic life, but unable to find satisfaction in the male work and public affairs world. Economic interests also had stakes in maintaining the traditional system. The entire industry of girls' schools, focused on accomplishments and deportment, would be threatened by shifts toward academic education. Teachers who built careers on needlework, music, or etiquette expertise would find their skills suddenly devalued. Publishers producing household management and feminine accomplishments books would lose their market. Families who invested in daughters' traditional education might resist reforms, making that investment seem misguided. Yet despite all opposition, change came slowly and unevenly, but inexorably. By the Victorian era's end, more girls received academic education, more women entered universities, and assumptions about female intellectual inferiority, justifying educational inequality, began crumbling. Reformers hadn't won complete victory. Gender gaps in education would persist well into the 20th century, and in some forms continue today. But they established the principle that women were capable of serious intellectual work and deserved opportunities to develop their minds fully. The story of these educational pioneers raises profound questions about how social change happens. Is proving existing assumptions wrong sufficient? Or must reformers also provide alternative visions addressing people's legitimate concerns about change? How do you balance bold, uncompromising demands with practical necessity of winning support from people not ready for radical transformation? These questions remain relevant as we continue grappling with educational inequality based on gender, race, class, and other factors. Chapter 6: The Psychological Legacy and the Price We Still Pay. Years have passed since those Victorian schoolrooms fell silent. The slate boards have been replaced by digital screens, the rigid wooden desks by collaborative learning spaces, the canes by positive reinforcement strategies. Yet the shadows cast by that era's educational philosophy stretch long into our present, shaping how we think about gender, ability, and human potential in ways we are only beginning to understand. Clara is now a married woman of 40, her accomplishments still on display in a parlor that represents everything her education promised to achieve. The embroidered samplers hang framed on walls, the piano sits polished in the corner, the watercolor landscape suggests taste and refinement. By Victorian standards, her education succeeded completely. She secured a respectable husband, manages a household efficiently, can direct servants politely, and stretch budgets without appearing anxious about money. When guests arrive, she orchestrates evenings with practiced grace, knowing precisely when to move to the piano and let Schubert drift through the lamplight. But the cost of this success reveals itself in quieter moments. Her education never taught her what to do with boredom that feels like slow suffocation, never trained her to turn curiosity into livelihood, never showed her how to channel intelligence into anything beyond child-rearing and social duties. The geography that once fascinated her in Miss Gray's lessons is now merely a collection of names on imported goods labels. The history she learned, great men, big battles, never taught her to understand the quiet wars inside her own heart. Edward, now established in business, embodies everything his schooling promised to create. The Latin verbs, the empire histories, the discipline of cold showers and muddy rugby fields have combined into an adult who can endure long hours, follow orders, give commands. He knows how to write persuasive letters, calculate interest, survey land, deliver speeches that impress superiors. His education gave him real, practical tools that opened doors of power his father never could have entered. Yet he carries his own invisible injuries. His school never taught him to name loneliness, express softness without shame, or understand a wife or sister as someone whose mind might equal his own. It never trained him to listen more than he spoke, question authority, or see the power structures he inhabits, instead of simply moving within them. He feels trapped by expectations that once seemed like promises, provider, leader, patriarch, roles he never chose, but that settled onto his shoulders like the heavy black school coat he wore as a boy. The Victorian educational system's psychological impact was profound and lasting, creating patterns of thought and behavior that many struggled their entire lives to overcome. When you teach children that their natural impulses are wrong, that their questions are inappropriate, that their ambitions are unfeminine or unmanly, you fundamentally alter their sense of self and relationship to the world. Consider the concept of learned helplessness, perfectly applicable to the Victorian educational experience. Girls were systematically taught that their opinions didn't matter, their preferences were irrelevant, their role was pleasing others rather than pursuing their own goals. They learned that speaking up led to punishment, asking questions was impertinent, asserting themselves brought social disapproval. Over time, many internalized these lessons so thoroughly that they genuinely lost the ability to identify their own desires or advocate for their own interests. The emphasis on accomplishments created another psychological trap, equating a woman's worth with her ability to perform femininity perfectly. Girls who spent hours creating elaborate embroidery or practicing piano pieces learned that their value lay not in who they were, but in what they could do to please others. They learned to view themselves as objects to be evaluated rather than subjects with their own interior lives and inherent worth. Boys face different but equally damaging psychological conditioning. The public school system's emphasis on emotional suppression, hierarchy, and competition created men who could lead empires but couldn't form intimate relationships. The fagging system, corporal punishment, and constant pressure to prove masculine worth produced adults who equated vulnerability with weakness and empathy with failure. Yet human resilience found ways to resist these limitations. Some Victorian women educated themselves secretly, reading forbidden books and teaching themselves subjects they were supposedly incapable of understanding. Others found creative ways to exercise their intellects within acceptable feminine pursuits, writing novels exploring complex moral questions, managing household finances with analytical rigor, engaging in amateur scientific observation that contributed to genuine knowledge even if unrecognized. The intergenerational transmission of these patterns is particularly troubling. Women educated to be passive, to suppress their own desires, to view themselves as less important than the men in their lives, often raised daughters with the same limitations. They couldn't teach what they'd never learned, couldn't encourage ambitions they'd been trained to see as inappropriate, couldn't model intellectual confidence they'd never been allowed to develop. Modern research in developmental psychology confirms what Victorian reformers intuitively understood. Early educational experiences have profound and lasting effects on psychological development. Children internalize messages they receive about their capabilities and worth, and these internalized messages shape behavior and choices throughout their lives. The Victorian educational system wasn't just teaching or failing to teach certain subjects, it was actively constructing gendered psychologies, creating men and women who would accept and perpetuate the gender hierarchy the system itself reflected and reinforced. As we look back at those Victorian classrooms, coal-smudged boys chanting Latin, neatly dressed girls stitching samplers, we realize how recent and fragile the idea of equal opportunity really is. The formal barriers to women's education fell gradually over several decades, but informal barriers and subtle biases persisted long after explicit discrimination was dismantled. Even today, when girls and boys theoretically have access to identical educational opportunities, patterns persist that echo Victorian assumptions. Girls continue to outperform boys in language arts, but lag in mathematics and physical sciences. They're more likely to choose careers in education, healthcare, and social services, while boys dominate engineering, computer science, and physical sciences. These patterns reflect complex combinations of genuine interest differences, lingering social pressures and stereotypes, and structural factors in how different fields are organized and valued. The question of what constitutes true educational equality remains contested. Is providing identical formal opportunities sufficient, or must we also address informal factors, socialization, cultural messages, role models, implicit biases that continue channeling men and women toward different paths? Should we aim for identical outcomes in all fields, or accept that even with complete equality of opportunity, men and women might make different choices on average? The Victorian educational system was not an aberration, but a logical expression of beliefs about gender, deeply embedded in social, economic, and political structures. Those beliefs haven't entirely disappeared, they've merely become less explicit, less formal, less easy to identify and challenge. The work of creating genuine educational equality is not finished, and perhaps never will be, because each generation must actively choose to reject inherited gender limitations and create new possibilities for those who follow. What can we learn from the Victorian experience? First, that educational systems are never neutral. They always reflect and reinforce the power structures and social hierarchies of their time. Second, that formal equality is necessary but not sufficient. Changing laws and policies is easier than changing deeply ingrained attitudes and assumptions. Third, that progress is possible but not inevitable. It requires conscious effort, sustained activism, and willingness to challenge comfortable assumptions. The Victorian girls who spent their days practicing needlework and deportment while their brothers studied Latin and mathematics were not less intelligent or capable than their male counterparts. They were victims of a system that deliberately limited their development, wasting their potential in service to a social order that benefited from their subordination. We honor their memory not by pitying them, but by ensuring that no child today is denied educational opportunities because of their gender, class, race, or any other aspect of their identity that has nothing to do with their capacity to learn and grow. So we return to our original question. Was Victorian education about enlightenment, or was it about control? The answer is clear. Those cold stone corridors and suffocating drawing rooms were not sanctuaries of learning, but factories for manufacturing human beings who would accept their predetermined roles without question. The boys lost their gentleness, the girls lost their strength. And in the drawing rooms and dining halls of Victorian Britain sat a silence that no amount of silver or mahogany could fill. The rich Victorian lifestyle was not a fairy tale, but a performance of perfection maintained by people broken in childhood to ensure they would never break character in adulthood. The greatest tragedy was not that they died, but that so many were never truly allowed to live. As you reflect on this journey through Victorian education, consider which role you might have been pushed into in that era and how different your life might feel if your education had been designed for someone else's comfort instead of your own potential. The Victorian era is over, but its ghosts still walk among us. The question is, what will you do to ensure they don't haunt the next generation?